Victory Land, Corey Ackley, Hamster Performance, with yet another exhaust video. And the question we pose on this is, should someone take and replace their existing factory 212 header with a 2-1 exhaust? What I'm going to tell you is that the margin of error is much greater on the 2-1 exhaust. The muffler is so much more important and can affect the output negatively with a much higher rate than it will positively, because the factory 212 is a pretty good exhaust system, and it also is much more forgiving on what muffler you run, slip-on you run on that. So what we've done here is we're comparing two different builds. We're comparing a buddy of mine's, Frank's bike, that was a Ness, DR cams, Lloyd's air filter, timing wheel, Power Commander 5. Had a, I think we put a 48 millimeter throttle body. This was the second throttle body that I tested. In my earlier videos, we talked about we tested throttle bodies. Again, the throttle body, I will say, is there are some trade-offs, there's some gains, and there's some losses in the RPM curve with that, and it's not worth the cost of the throttle body, the tuning, and all those kind of things. So that's a disclaimer on throttle bodies. With that being said, we ran a series of mufflers on his cross country or Magnum, and we'll compare those. Well, what I will say is that the factory header will overcome many design flaws or variants in the muffler and show a much less margin. A 2-1, because you don't have Cadillac converters, you don't have these other things, diverter pipes and such like that that's inside the factory header. With a 2-1, the muffler becomes critical. Either you'll throw away a ton of power, or you can make a little more. But the chances of throwing away a ton of power is a whole lot greater with a 2-1 system with the wrong muffler than it is with the 212 factory header, okay? On the second test, I used my cross country. And on my cross country, I had a modified 2008 212 header into a true 2-1. And that was off a 2008 Vision. So, and on that, I ran a series of mufflers with modified baffles, off-the-shelf mufflers, and some original slip-ons on there. Now, this is a different combination. My bike had Andrew 472 cams. It also had a 48.5 millimeter throttle body, and a couple other things going there. So these are not apples and apples comparison, but what you'll see when we go to the dynographs is that there is a massive difference in torque at 2500, torque at 3500, and peak horsepower that you do not see that kind of discrepancy with almost any muffler using the factory 212 header. Okay? All right, let's transition into the graphs. On this graph here, so this is the Victory Magnum with the factory 212 header, DR cams, and all the other supporting mods. And then we've run a Bassani mufflers, Lloyd mufflers, Tri-Ovals, Raging Cajun DDTs, and Vance and Hines. What you notice, if you look to the first thing, if you look all the way to the far right, they all made within a horsepower and a half of each other. So they all peaked horsepower within 200 RPM, and they all made within a horsepower and a half, or I would call dyno variants within there. Now, if you go to the other side of the scale, okay, if you look at 2500, you have a foot-pound of torque difference at 2500 between the best and the worst. And then if you look at 3750, you have a 6 foot-pound of torque difference between the best and the worst. So there's the muffler, though, makes a difference. The Vans and Hines and Lloyds were a little softer down bottom, but they made the most mid-range. The Tri-Ovals made a really flat, as they always do, a really flat torque curve. And the Raging Cajuns were right in there in the middle. So not a big difference when it comes to the impacts of the muffler to performance on a cammed cross-country, Crossroads, or Magnum up to this point. Okay, on this graph, this is my 2014 cross-country with a 2008 modified Vision header into a true 2-1. And on this one here, we use a whole assortment of mufflers as well. We use atom bombs. We use a modified slip-on or modified stock can that I did. Tri-oval with no baffle, a tri-oval with a baffle, and tri-oval with a modified baffle, and a thunder header. If you look at the far right of the scale, like we did in the last one, we'll look at peak horsepower first. What we see with these mufflers on a 2-1 is we have a variance of almost 8 horsepower at peak torque. So when we looked at the horsepower variance on all the mufflers on the stock header pipe, we had a 1.5 horsepower difference. Here we have almost 8 horsepower difference. Much larger margin of error. Now, if we go back to the other end of the scale, we look at 2500. At 2500, the Tri-Oval with no baffle and the thunder header were down 17 foot-pounds of torque at 2500 between the Tri-Oval with a modified baffle, the HSP, my baffle, and then the atom bombs. And then if we look at 3750, we have an 11 foot-pound of torque variance between the best and the worst at 3750. So as you see in these two different graphs, the margin of error is much greater with a 2-1 than it is with the factory 212 exhaust. Let's wrap it up. Okay, so hopefully I didn't confuse anyone, but really all I was trying to show, even though these are two different builds, what you'll see is that, again, if you don't have a dyno or you don't have access to some other resources, if you just grab a 2-1 and you throw it on your cross country with a cam, and you say, hey, well, the Tri-Ovals do really well on a stock cross country header, and you put the Tri-Oval on, you may see a massive, a pretty good drop in power. That's just an example. The point of it is that with a 2-1, we see here how critical the muffler dynamics are, muffler design is on the output, because you only have one muffler, you have all the exhaust flowing to that one muffler, you don't have a diverter plate to drive exhaust to the passenger side like you do in a factory header, and you don't have two cats that will all work and to keep velocity up. So muffler designs become super critical in the output of the power. And so if you don't have all those resources, maybe you stick with what we know works, and that's the stock 212 header with a good muffler, whether it's the Tri-Ovals, Raging Cajun exhaust, the atom bomb, something that we know works real well, and you don't have to worry about, is the exhaust hurting you or not. You may not make the absolute most power, but without a bunch of tools, times, and resources, you may not know that, because what we didn't do here is I didn't do this experiment with a 2-1 with a Lloyd's DR cams. I did it with a different camshaft. Different camshaft is going to have different requirements on exhaust flow. Okay, cool. Well, hopefully that makes sense, and hopefully we cleared up a little bit of that confusion from the last video where I had some feedback of people wanting to do modified exhaust, and we think ultimately they would lose power. All right, thanks.